In matters of fate, answers are either right or wrong, what will be and what will not. Maybe you are willing to pay a certain price in the pursuit of happiness, but unfortunately, fate does not negotiate. That is the cruelest thing about fate. It is unmoved by your sacrifices. Fate has always been a staple concept in the world of Teyvat, always regarded as a force needed to be overcome or an independent entity imposing its dominion on gods and the common folk alike. But there have been numerous events where this seemingly omnipotent actor gets set aside thanks to intervention of greater authorities. Like in the case of the Archons, we have the nation of Fontaine, which was prophesied to be washed away for their sins of tampering with life, hence bestowing upon them a causal verdict that will subject its humans to be reclaimed by the same primordial sea they originated from. If not for Focalor's 500-year deception and Farina's inhuman feat of performing such a divine facade, it wouldn't have been possible for the heavenly principles to be deceived. This specific condition was the primary leverage that allowed Focalor to return the rightful elemental authority to Neuvillette, who has the capability to command the primordial sea. But we learned later in the bedtime story quest that the etchings of the prophetic stone slates in Fontaine was a speculated doing of one of Khaenri'ah's 5 sinners, Vedrfolnir. Speaking of which, the excerpt in the beginning of this video were also his words in a stakeful dialogue with a fellow sinner, Rerir, during his supposed prison break and the uprising against the Vinster King. Throughout the recent Notcry Archon Quest, we've constantly been reinforced with the fact that Vedrfolnir's visions have always come true, and this has been a major cornerstone for developing Rerir's significance in the story, as well as in uncovering his motives as to why he harbors hatred for the moons. It turned out that he was a victim of circumstance, a tragic character in a fated story of star-crossed lovers alongside his beloved Tholindis. On one end, we can attribute this tragedy to the simple yet insidious interaction that occurred during his get-along with Vedrfolnir in Dainsleif, where he shared about his proposal towards his fiancée. Vedrfolnir might have played a sinister role as to why this tragedy spiraled quickly, but I don't think he's the sole factor to be focused on, since foresight makes him so that he couldn't help but react, especially when he did enough de-escalation by not disclosing his visions to Rerir, and the latter can also be just as major of a participant in his own tragedy due to his own tendency for paranoia. But on the other end, we cannot discount the influence of the Vinster King's eventual fondness of abyssal powers. After all, the Abyss has an undeniable influence on the king's persecution of the Crimson Moon dynasty's lineage. So, on the surface, it might look like the Abyss gave Khaenri'ahs the ability to perceive and steer the workings of fate. And while that is true to some extent, fate already runs its course and has always been perceivable, dating further back before the heavenly principles usurped the authority of the dragons. Exception as it may look, but the Voyager's earliest encounter with Nibelung was one, if not the earliest proof, that fate has been perceivable in Teyvat. But why does it even matter to delve into this comprehensibility of fate if such a term is simply being alluded to the heavenly principles, or the forbidden knowledge seated at the deepest bottoms of the abyss? It is all because fate in itself doesn't care, and it's only as significant as the beings who deem it powerful: humans. Denalists, stick with me as I go through the idea of how fate is nothing but a coveted narrative, how Teyvat's fate hangs on the idea of love, and how fate might get involved in possibly the hardest choice that the traveler will ever make. I'm Merkanique, and I'll be putting lore in Explore. Tilting the Scales, a muse named Fate. In most of the story quests that involve or mention Khaenri'ah, we often stumble upon the notion of fate, where most of the time it becomes the scapegoat of various calamities that have plagued Khaenri'ah and its descendants. Clothar Alberic, for instance, kept on insisting that fate has done atrocities to him and his people, but it's not entirely faulty of him to think that way, because Khaenri'ah has gone through the extremes of suffering as a result of multiple factors. It's not solely that Celestia handed down curses upon them. I believe the heavenly principles or the Shades only acted as needed given their fair share of dealings with abyssal powers during Nibelung's War of Vengeance. We may try to focus the blame on the Vinster King, but whether this can be justified or not is tricky due to the fact that the Eclipse dynasty has been dabbling with abyssal powers. Ideally, kings would often aspire for the betterment of his people, but we barely know if this era of advancements, forbidden knowledge, and technologies under the Vinster King's rule would be taken as an attempt for prosperity. After all, the Crimson Moon has been dead, given it being the reflection of the iridescent moon, which also got shattered following the events of the funerary year. Khaenri'ah is also known to be a godless nation, so if their respective moon deity is not anymore with them, alongside the fact that they don't have ties to the divine, the attempts of the Vinster King to pursue the use of abyssal powers could be justified in this case. At the same time, when we explored Rerir's origins through Nefer's chess box set, we discovered that among the Khaenri'ahns, there has always been the continuous touch of infighting. Again, this can be due to the Vinster King's extreme measures, or it could just be part of the nation's nature given how their society is fully human-led. Clothar Alberich is not the only one to share such sentiment of fate. In fact, most of this seemingly maddening contempt is common among Khaenri'ahn people. We have another great example in Rerir, who insists on staying together with Tholindis, setting aside the insights of Vedrfolnir. Yet at the end, he still bargains with the possibility of never being separated from Tholindis, even if in reality, he already treaded the same fate Vedrfolnir has foresaw, which led him to be the monster he is at present. But were any of them right about their notion of fate? I think that given how Khaenri'ah is a human-governed nation, they may be just reaping the natural consequences of human conflict and human limitations. In stark contrast with humans from the Seven, this notion of fate is felt more intensely in those of the Underground Kingdom. The only difference as to how this isn't the case on the surface is due to the present reverence of its respective human inhabitants to their gods or designated archon. In a way, we could liken the constellations of those who could make use of the elements to the insights of Vedrfolnir. I made a video partly on the significance of constellations months ago, and you can see them in my channel or in the descriptions below, so if you have time, you should spend a couple of moments to check it out to catch on to some key context I might be implying here. But going back, these constellations are one of the supposed hallmarks of the workings of fate in Teyvat. In one of the loading screens, it even suggests that wherever you go and whatever life throws at you, the stars in the sky will always have a place for you. And I suddenly thought, will Khaenri'ah be among these whenever places? The thing is, both yes and no can be justifiable. Yes, because you have distant descendants of those who hailed from Khaenri'ah like Arlecchino and Capitano. The latter may have laid in dormancy, but given how the rest of the Fatui Harbingers have symbols that tie in with their actual constellations, it can be a sound speculation to assume that Capitano also had a constellation reserved for him despite being among the Khaenri'ahns inflicted with the curse of immortality. No would also make sense, because theoretically, Khaenri'ah is a nation that never went under the purview of the gods, which is where the Khaenri'ahn resentment towards fate stems from. This is further reinforced by two things. One is that the Heavenly Principles, the same entity that decimated Khaenri'ah, has the ability to puppeteer the mortals of the human realm with the stars of the constellations. Needless to say, they have some sort of control over the stars, only with the exception of certain beings who don't fall under this puppeteering system, such as the Traveler and Neuvillette, having special classifications as a Descender and a Dragon Sovereign respectively. The second reinforcement is that during the era that followed the funerary year, when the Voyager and the First Angel were subjected to eternal separation after the rebellion was blown by the Heavenly Principles, the silver carriage that holds the motion of the three moons was suddenly overturned and the Hall of Stars got destroyed. This, I think, was the time when the Heavenly Principles managed to seize control over the stars, because the separation of the Voyager and the First Angel, as well as the Three Moons disaster and alleged betrayal to Nibelung, followed the defeat of the Dragon Sovereign against the Heavenly Principles during the War of Vengeance. It would fit the notion that fate deserted Khaenri'ah, because their link to fate would have been under the presence of the Crimson Moon, if the iridescent moon wasn't shattered. So then my inference would suggest that the stars which host the fate of almost every being in Teyvat was originally under the authority of the three moons, and by extension, Nibelung as well. Hence, this could explain why Neuvillette, despite donning a human form, is an exception to the puppeteering ability that the Heavenly Principles incorporate with the stars and constellations. However, this does not mean they are immune to this manufactured control over fate. Even if the heavenly principles managed to steal the stars that originally have been governed by the three moons during Nibelung's absence, this sense of control is more or less an illusion and does not account for the entirety of the concept of fate. When the Voyager discovered Nibelung and Teyvat, she warned him that Teyvat will eventually lead to its end, prompting the dragon to journey with her beyond the stars. This is where I got intrigued, because how did the Voyager manage to come up with this prediction when we already established the idea that Nibelung and the other sovereigns have been Teyvat's original overseers? This is why I mentioned that they are not immune, because fate never really bends under those who control the stars. If Teyvat is really fated for destruction, then there really isn't anyone who can avert this possibility. Would Nibelung be able to? Personally, I don't think so, and the following events that led to the War of Vengeance and the subsequent catastrophes emerged in its wake just prove that the fate of Teyvat's inevitable end holds true. This resembles the exact pattern in dealing with fate similar to Rerir's circumstance influenced by Vedrfolnir's foresight, where Rerir in this case is Nibelung and Vedrfolnir being the Voyager. But how exactly will Teyvat end? Depending on the specific events in the entire timeline, we could in fact say that Teyvat already ended. The arrival of the heavenly principles? Technically, yes, since Teyvat used to be dominated by the Light Realm and there were no ways for humans to inhabit it. Hence, the heavenly principles had to intervene. The War of Vengeance? We can take it as an end if we place emphasis on the perspective of the dragons. The Cataclysm? Sure, this was catastrophic for Teyvat's humanity, but even resets require a sort of end. Not to mention that with popular theories suggesting that Teyvat runs on cycles, eventual destruction might have been embedded in this cyclic fate, that it had inevitably happened many times already and will happen all the same. This unfolding of fate is also similar to my very first example with the Fontaine prophecy. No one, not even the Traveler, could stop this prophecy, and it eventually happened as the Stone Slates had foretold. How the prophecy turned out to be wrong was because the people of Fontaine survived the massive flooding event thanks to Nouvelette's absolution of the Oceanid's original sin. This goes in opposition to Egeria or Vedrfolnir's interpretation of the prophecy that only the Hydro Archon would remain and the rest of the people would be washed away. But in my opinion, regardless of what happened, it's still fate. I think the reason why the concept of fate is being confused with the gaze of the heavenly principles is due to the fact that the outcome was framed under the narrative of the heavenly principles. So the prophecy is wrong if we look at the intended outcome, but it would be right if we look at the event itself. Whether reenacted or not would still be accounted as fate. Basically, fate is never right or wrong, but it's guaranteed whether something is meant to happen or not, and it doesn't care about the results either. The divergencies will then only come through these various interpretations of those deemed fitting to control or transcend Teyvat's worldly mechanisms, such examples being the heavenly principles, the archons under certain cases, the abyss, the dragon sovereigns, and as a category, the descenders. Each of them do have existing biases that shape their perception of fate. Perhaps that's why for Zhongli, the traveler's journey would be important as Teyvat's witness, not just because they are a descender capable of defying fate with their own wills, but also due to them shouldering another fate-defying force granted upon them by destined events and perspective, that force being the human will. Khaenri'ah originally has it due to the fact that they don't have a god to guide them. The Universitas Magistrorum housed studies of alchemy and astrology, indicating that they have enough resources to interpret fate through human striving. It's only until the abyssal powers have been introduced that Khaenri'ahns pivoted from the power humanity already possessed to this new ominous eldritch force out of the desire to transcend to greater powers. And what's more disturbing in this context is how the abyss was capable of imposing its own narrative interpretation of fate, so much so that it deems other narrative interpretations as inferior. This is quite similar to the real-world counterpart of the idea that evil seems to always permeate at the top and how events that always happen are thanks to power that facilitates it. To which then it extends to the power games in society, which in the game is also strongly present. You can view the heavenly principles as evil due to their act of usurpation against the dragons, but I would say the same for the abyss. that even though they are only used as means to defeat the heavenly principles, this is part of the narrative it pushes to become more powerful and be able to impose itself. This is extremely deceptive because of another possibility that the heavenly principles may not be evil and were instead acting out of necessity. Maybe this is due to the Voyager's prior insight that Teyvat will inevitably end. It may also justify the necessity aspect given the idea that humanity has been pushing their limits again in the main storyline, and yet they show no signs of waking up. But I'm not discounting the fact that the heavenly principles tether towards the evil aspect, because of course, we have this new information from the Hymns of the Far North that the Gnosis were the result of the heavenly principles' fragmentation of Saarelainen into pieces, which at this point is already strongly implied to be the third descender. This then would precede the entire sentiment of the Tsaritsa and the Fatui, whose region is being set up to center around their shared rebellion against Celestia. Considering both the Archon and the Harbingers hailing from various regions deal with the same nature of grief that stemmed from the heavenly principles' doing. But I want to take this moment and ask you all another question. Since I mentioned that both the Abyss and the category of Descenders can defy fate and Teyvat's laws, is it possible for an entity to become both a Descender and a wielder of abyssal power? If no, do you think that this explains why the Traveler Sibling wasn't classified as a Descender? Last but not the least, do you believe the Voyager to be the second Descender? For now, I will be moving on to a more polarizing power that could make the Abyss more terrifying in Teyvat's power game while also being the factor that serves humanity in its pure state. To heed the sting, the bottomless demands of love. I previously introduced the book Hymns of the Far North, which earned its current reputation as the new Before Sun and Moon in the lore community. Originally, I'm not really fond of books in Genshin due to the fact that they are less accessible for me to initialize a lore theory craft. Hence, in my past videos, I rely more on symbolism and certain details that hit me during any Archon or world quests. And so I tried it for myself, swallowed any last bit of resistance to conformity, and read the book just as the hardcore lore tubers did, and I was convinced enough why this book had immense archival value. Within the book listed several prayers dedicated to Teyvat's major divine and historical actors, some towards the heavenly principles and the shades, some towards the moons, and some towards Nibelung and the first angel. But among them is a prayer dedicated to Saarelainen, a young lad who sought to wed the daughter of Pakkaisuko and was forced to embark on a nigh dangerous mission of opening the gates of Pohjola. Should he step back from his trial, Pakkaisuko would hand over the punishment to his daughter instead. Saarelainen, despite knowing this mad negotiation imposed on him, ventures to the dark, misty land of Pohjola, to which he is led to his demise. At the hands of the Lord of the Seven Calamities, he was carved into 7 pieces, leaving the daughter with unfulfilled longing, irreversible grief over the fate of her betrothed. As I mentioned a while ago, Saarelainen is widely implied to be the third descender by the general lore consensus due to the existing information that links the Lord of the Seven Calamities to the heavenly principles and the 7 pieces to the Gnosis. By extension, this rouses a reasoning from the evidence of the Tsaritsa's aim of seizing the Gnosis. In this case, the Tsaritsa would be the daughter of Pakkaisuko, who is then supposed to be the Bel Tar. However, the remaining term Pohjola is quite an interesting case. I've seen content that cover this book alluding this to be Celestia, but I doubt it would be Celestia due to the following reasons. One is that Pohjola in the book is said to be a dark, mist-shrouded land, which somehow contradicts the location of Celestia due to it being a sky structure with no records and information describing it to be foggy. At least not yet. And 2 is that the word Pohjola has various depictions in Finnish mythology that doesn't quite align with Celestia's description as the abode of the divine. Most of these depictions liken Pohjola to Tartarus and the underworld, with many depicting it as a realm for the dead. For me, it would make more sense for Pohjola to be an intermediary location that leads to Khaenri'ah. As to the gate that the Bel-Yitar wanted Saarelainen to open, this would perhaps be similar to the giant door deep underground in the desert of Sumeru. Feel free to refute my speculations here, because I'd also want to confirm if Khaenri'ah's kingdom really spans wide enough to reach the far north of the Seven. But in the case that this is implausible, my other speculation would be that Pohjola is Hyperborea, or at least its related vicinities, due to its tangential lore with the angels alongside their association with mists and the night. This considers the case of the first angel Koitar, where she was cursed alongside the other angels in an attempt to collude with the Voyager in the rebellion against the heavenly principles. And come to think of it, this would pass as a logic as to why Saarelainen was carved into the Gnosis by the heavenly principles, which I presume was done out of apprehension due to the place's highly restricted context. Now, the reason why I brought up a dedicated section for Saarelainen is due to my own notion that this event must have been pivotal in the history of Snezhnaya. That's also given that the land and its Archon is associated with the ideal of love. And since the newest Archon Quest gave us another tragic love story to be used as reference, I figured that the ideal of love might entail significant lore undertones that needed attention. That's also considering that it's the final region that the traveler will venture to among the Seven, before maybe heading to Khaenri'ah to begin the finale if hoyoverse sees no need to put regional intermissions. In exploring this idea of love, I want to focus on three major examples that have been revealed to us in the story or in the books. The first is a run-through and a rehash of the story of Saarelainen and the Tsaritsa, to which I will explore the lore of the Bel-Yitar by extension. The second would be the story of Koitar and the Voyager, where I will further explore the logic behind the heavenly principles' punishment of eternal separation. And the third would be our recent tragic story of Rerir and Tholindis, where I will attempt to use the ideal of love to dive deeper into Khaenri'ah's most fundamental conflict between two world-defying forces. So, to start with, I wanted to revisit the section where the book explains Pakkaisuko's cutthroat condition for Saarelainen to receive his blessing in asking for his daughter's hand. Why is it that Pakkaisuko is not appalled by the idea of punishing his daughter, who did nothing wrong in the midst of a trial that is only meant for her lover? If Pakkaisuko is really the Bel-Yitar in this case, I think this would only make sense if his ideals of love that time had a catch. This brings us to a brief backstory about him as the King of Winter Holly and his younger brother being the King of Summer Oak, where a tale pertains to them as twin monarchs who are in endless struggle against each other as seasons change. This endless struggle is furthered by recounts such as a tragic quarrel that caused the Bel-Yitar to accidentally kill his younger brother and the returning from the underworld to rule in turn until the end of time. However, this isn't tragic just because it involves slaying a kin, as the Bel-Yitar was recounted to really love his younger brother dearly. The endless struggle might have been part of necessary events resulting from either fate itself or a portion of the imposing narrative ruler, which in this case would be the heavenly principles, due to the already long thriving of humanity during this time. The changing of seasons might also be of cultural importance to Snezhnaya, and the emphasis on the nation's harsh winter landscape was an aftermath of this tragic quarrel, which might be among Snezhnaya's pivotal events in their history. Now, I'm not sure on which possible event in Tevat could this tragic quarrel possibly refer to, because it can both pertain to the Archon War, where many different gods have fought over the Divine Thrones and the Gnosis, or an entirely different event before the Archon War began. If the mentioned Pohjola would be similar to this underworld where the Bel-Yitar returned from, then this might also be a place that ties to his endless struggle with his younger brother. Given that this tragic quarrel resulted in the Bel-Yitar's cold and freezing grief, it could explain why he wouldn't have any kindness or mercy left in his heart that he'd be willing to punish even his daughter over an onset of an affair with Saarelainen. This then could cause the Descender, knowing his world-defying capability, to be used by the Belly Tar to achieve some means to bring back his younger brother from the dead, which may have triggered the Heavenly Principles' apprehension. Or Pojola could have been a place of trial itself where the endless struggle came from, where if we consider the alternating seasons and the ruling in turn until the end of time, the victor could be getting the honor to impose his rule in Snezhnaya, possibly for eternity. In this case, sending Saarelainen there could be taken as a form of sacrifice, a sacrifice that, just like the Bailey Tar went through, was made in the crucible of Pojola to catalyze an outcome that sets the fate of the land of Snezhnaya. Perhaps from this precedent, we can see the same philosophy of love unfold from the Tsaritsa's actions. Just like her father, she still grieves for the loss of her lover, which drove her to seize the Gnosis. And just like her father, Project Stucha might be a form of sacrificial love done amongst the inhabitants of Teyvat itself to set precedence on the future fate of the world. I just hope that in this rebellion of hers, the Traveler won't suffer the same outcome as Saarelainen did. At this point, love shows us its branching into two undertones, being grief and sacrifice, with a precedence that demands rebellion as both cryo-archons have sought against the Heavenly Principles. This brings us to the case of the first Angel Qoytar and the Voyagers meeting, where rebellion takes the helm on their side of love. In the finale of the Deep Gallery's artifact description, it tells about how the people of Hyperborea found themselves on the bad side of the angels for questioning the wisdom of the gods. They quarreled amongst themselves in an attempt to come up with a resolution to appease the angels. It was until a voice of a boy was heard, questioning the very taboo of inquiry and the pursuit of knowledge. He then asked Qoytar with a revelation. He introduced himself and gave light to his origins as he inquired for Teyvat's forbidden origins in return. It was from here that Qoytar felt free through the breaking of her crown and felt truly in love. Throughout their interaction since their union, they began planning for the rebellion, having Qoytar teach the Voyager the forbidden secrets of creation, while the Voyager musters up all his capabilities to stand with her and the rest of the angels. And from that, the rest is history. The Heavenly Principles cast down the nails 30 days after and cursed the angels into becoming Seelies should they fall in love with anyone, stripping them of both form and wisdom. Contrary to the story of Saarelainen, we can clearly have a better view on the role love plays here. After all, the Heavenly Principles had the Seelie curse centered around this concept as a condition. What's more telling is that the sense of freedom told through the breaking of the crown possibly happened simultaneously with Qoytar falling in love, considering that Qoytar was the first angel of the Heavenly Principles who has given the angels the duty as stewards of humanity, as they possess the wisdom to guide them through teachings of language, philosophies, and oracles. It could be possible that the idea of love runs counter to divine wisdom, so much so that the Heavenly Principles deem it as taboo leaning. But that wouldn't also be right, because they are said to be commanded to love all creatures of the world equally. I believe that love only turned dangerous when the Voyager got involved. This Voyager was a mere visitor in Teyvat, even only managed to visit twice. His inquiry about Teyvat's forbidden origin might have snuzzled with his or her initial visit, where at that time, she let Nibelung know that Teyvat will face an inevitable end. I know it was confusing, but I think the Voyager's gender is still up to debate. But anyway, Teyvat's inevitable end might be due to its same forbidden origin, and I think this is the same area of knowledge that the Heavenly Principles are actively barring away from what humankind is only allowed to gain. And by the way, if I take into account the possibility that the Voyager is the second Descender, then it would be a wonderful piece of lore that draws from the parallel case of Asmodee missing and being in the company of her new master. We of course know that the Heavenly Principles would not be a fan of switching sides. Now that we extracted the dynamic between knowledge and love, it is time to bring everything into cohesion with our third case, that of Rerir and Tholindis. Their story might be the most tragic among the three, but in addition, this might also be the most treacherous. To briefly recap, their story introduces the fundamental conflict within Khaenri'ah, that which involves the Eclipse and the Crimson Moon dynasties. Rerir is an ordinary man who works as an executioner for the Eclipse dynasty. His job was to identify those who belong to the Crimson Moon dynasty and neutralize them for being threats to Khaenri'ah's current dynasty, going as far as taking out innocent people, children, and descendants just by mere association. However, among the mixed descendants who Rerir was tasked to include for his work reveals Tholindis, who also has been researching moon marrow in the Universitas Magistrorum. She faces her own crisis of this sudden change of resource dependence where the Universitas is slowly shifting to research of abyssal power. But aside from that, she also faces persecution as a descendant of the Crimson Moon dynasty people, where upon knowing of Rerir's real work, she is faced with the dilemma of self-preservation and relational trust. This made her keep it a secret from Rerir whenever they were together, but little did she know that her beloved would also be condemned to do the same. Rerir also kept his work a secret out of the potential scrutiny that Tholindis would react adversely to him or see him as a monster which would cost the relationship. And Rerir really wanted to tie the knot with her. He wanted for them to stay together, and it's clear that he really did love Tholindis deeply. But this same demeanor, similar to how women would wish their boyfriends to be, would already plant the preface on how love would be his same downfall. I just wanted to add some emphasis that the time of which these events were unfolding was where the harnessing of abyssal power has become more prevalent. It spans up until the point where dainsleif gathers other important figures in Khaenri'ah to rebel against the king. This is also where the king gouged out the eyes of Vedrfolnir when enraged after being told that Khaenri'ah would fall should it continue his path. So how did these things contribute to the tragedy between Rerir and Tholindis? For that, we need to remember that there are higher categories of entities who can transcend Tevat's laws. For Khaenri'ah, the major players involved are the Abyss, the Heavenly Principles, and the Moons. The involvement of the Abyss was a given due to the Eclipse dynasty's active push to harness its energy. The Heavenly Principles, however, wasn't directly involved as far as pre-cataclysm is concerned, but know that humanity was created by the Heavenly Principles to dwell on Tevat, so their involvement would be warranted by the sheer fact that Khaenri'ah was purely run by humans. As for the Moons, the oldest history of Khaenri'ah revolved around the Crimson Moon dynasty, tying its involvement through that dynasty and the kingdom's early reliance on the moon marrow knowledge. The moon marrow would prove to be significantly related due to it being a far extension of Nibelung with how he created the three moons to govern Tevat in his absence. This would also allude to the integration of the human realm and the light realm, which gives them the means to deal with abyssal energies. They should find themselves in the same dynamic interplay as Nodcries, where Kuvaki and abyssal power tend to overcome each other depending on which force is present. If we go back to Tholindis, we encounter her in the space leading to the iridescent moon marrow's chamber. We are welcomed by flashbacks of her pondering on the existence of some power that could run counter to the abyssal havoc that permeates in Khaenri'ah. She deduces that it can be unlocked through the power of the three moons, and in my head, there is only one possible source of power that this can allude to: the Kuvaki. Or maybe it could be tied to a greater power similar to what Columbina is after in her pursuit of recovering her strength. But this just tells us that Tholindis stood by the forces of the moon, which would be the power of Kuvaki. Then we move to Rerir, who, as the narrative continues to focus on, was a nobody who has been compelled to carry out his tasks as an executioner agent in order to survive. Apart from the nature of his work, which he needed to keep a secret from Tholindis, his mind was filled with ominous dread ever since he took notice of Vedrfolnir's reaction when he shared his proposal to Tholindis. Vedrfolnir during these events is already renowned for his prophetic ability, though we don't know whether this came from the Abyss or it's an innate power that the lore is yet to expound on. But though he never stayed close with the king in dabbling with abyssal energy, he was part of the team dainsleif sought to assemble to prevent this further catastrophe that spirals out of control due to the king's obsession over the abyss. So before he became a sinner, his prophetic ability might have been akin to our prior example on how the angels bestow oracles to humanity to better understand the future. And just like how the angels have a limited ability to foresee the future, Vedrfolnir's prophetic ability might also be limited in a sense that he can only influence the fates of those who don't belong to our world-defying exceptions. What this means for Rerir is that he was more or less a victim of circumstance, except this circumstance is aggravated by human obsession, conflict, and an otherworldly power. Maybe when Rerir harnessed the abyssal powers for himself, it came with the logic that he'll be able to reunite with Tholindis again, but we can only be sure that Vedrfolnir's visions have always remained interpretive. That was until the 5 sinners came to wield abyssal powers. For Rerir, things indicated by the so-called fate have always stood still. Tholindis would always remain to stay with Moon Marrow research, and nothing could change that. Their secret's revelation only sealed their separation. She entered a mysterious portal as she parted ways with Rerir, making it seem like a final loving sacrifice for Rerir to live a better life without the burden of having to assassinate his beloved. And for Rerir, her loss would have stayed as grief, which then, similar to the Bel-Etar and the Tsaritsa, it could have been channeled into rebellion. This rebellion could have given him the leverage to still carry out what ought to be done led by Dainsleif, but alas, he never let go of Tholindis and chose the other side in the tug-of-war with the moon's Kuvaki. He spiraled into obsession, like how the sinners and the Khaenri'ah humanity forsake the human will to embrace their new master in the abyss. In hopes of defying fate, the abyss only offered a caressing distortion of what was once granted to humans. From love, it became hate. From knowledge, it became arrogation, and from language, it became curses. But should this obsession not have resulted in opening the Pandora's box of the abyss, we would have seen the good that it brings to humanity. So much so that this obsession, through the conviction in human will, created the likes of Dainsleif and Capitano. This would tell us more about humanity's role in the games of fate, and how this will be a critical point in the traveler's most difficult ordeal. The turning point, the human fate, and the sibling rivalry. It's been common knowledge to us that the heavenly principles usurped the power of the dragons and created humanity and the human realm to turn Teyvat into their dwelling. Yet, this poses a long-running question that is yet to be answered. Why? Why would they create humanity in a world that was originally owned by the dragons and was of pure elemental essence? Surely the human race in Teyvat must have had a transcendent quality to them that allows them to come up with answers in the world's ever-changing fate. The glorification of the kingdom of Khaenri'ah and Dainsleif's notion of humanity, as we hear from the Travail trailer, must have had significant basis, or else the role of humanity in Teyvat would be pretty much overrated. However, I'd like to bring up another common knowledge that might give us an idea on the kind of power humanity possesses in the larger scale of things in Teyvat. We know that among the Fatui harbingers, the highest 3 have powers that are equal to that of gods. These 3 would consist of columbina being the 3rd, Dottore being the 2nd, and Capitano being the 1st. As of present in Nodcry, we are being more familiarized with Columbina's narrative as the moon goddess of the Frost Moon, and that since the beginning of the Archon Quest, she's been in dire need of time to recover her strength. While the tension rises leading up to a full-scale confrontation with Rerir, our interactions with Columbina during this story or in her Selenic Chronicles fill us in on necessary information about Kuvaki, the Moon Marrows, and the kind of power she possesses. In the climax of the coordinated fight in Act 4, we were shown more of how Columbina can use Rerir's power against him through the alchemical methods of Albedo with the help of Durin, which was founded on the idea that Kuvaki and abyssal energy tend to overcome each other depending on which was present. So it makes sense with how Columbina would garner such a power standing, given that she is a moon goddess who has the ability to wield basically the inverse of abyssal energy. But that would only account to her being the 3rd harbinger. So what then makes Dottore and Capitano more powerful than her in theory? There's only little that we know about the full background of Dottore apart from his already existing involvement in the burning of the Irminsul, his influence from the shadows that set the Sumeru Archon Quest in motion, and that he had many different segments to which Nahida requested to get rid of in exchange of the Dendro Gnosis. But maybe we could draw an idea about his power from both his research interests and his agendas, especially in his joint plan with Pantalone. From the many readables we pick up while exploring areas like Devantaka Mountain, the ominous hospital in Dar al-Shifa, and the ruined golem in the ruins of Dari, we get information on Dottore's research endeavors, who was still known as Zandik at the time. Highlights of his research include the study on mechanical beings and the elevation of human cognition, as with the case of the administering of Archon residue to the hospital patients and Kale. The Shoki no Kami was also made possible due to his involvement, and considering its mechanical makeups and its foundation of holding arcane wisdom, we can infer the main aims of his research. His collaboration with Pantalone is centered around overturning the status quo that exists between gods and humanity, and he plans to achieve this by pushing human intelligence to a point where it could go beyond that of gods. Knowledge in itself is a vast concept when viewed as power, and when you have a nation that dedicates itself to the accumulation and regulation of information and knowledge, it can be inferred that whatever those are that they consider sins in the academia can tell us about which types of knowledge are corrupt in nature. The sins are listed as such: interfering with human evolution, tampering with life and death, delving beyond the universe, investigating the origin of words, revering gods without acts of devotion, and attempting the forbidden and fearing none. I'd leave it up to your imaginations to theorize some of those corrupt knowledge and products of such. Dottore's actions such as the burning of Irminsul, the continuing research on mechanical life forms, and the supplementing of natural and the cataclysmic energies on human test subjects clearly fall within most of the listed sins we just went through. But we could draw some parallels with events from the larger history of Teyvat to come to a logical conclusion as to why knowledge can end up being more fate-defying than a primordial power like Kuvaki. For instance, the burning of Irminsul would fit the category of attempting the forbidden due to its blasphemous intent. We know the Irminsul as a core source of knowledge, memories, and information all across Teyvat. Burning such a critical source would be a form of challenging the range of knowledge humans can only learn. And this was the exact sentiment of the Voyager when the Hyperborean priests were pointing fingers when the angels got mad due to the mere sinful act of questioning the gods' knowledge. The research on mechanical life forms also shares its resemblance with the purpose of Khaenri'ah's ruined machines. Not only is Dottore actively researching these specific types of automatons, but it happens to align with his objective of furthering human capacity, since Khaenri'ah's sentiment has the ruined machines serve as human mimetic creations of the existing natural creatures, like the hypostases and the vishops. I created a poll exploring the possible origins of the field tiller, and the reason being that if we find out who or how the ruined machines were created, we could have a better grasp on what makes human knowledge so powerful as reflected by Dottore. Should it be Certology, we could get an idea that human knowledge in itself can be a weapon to be utilized or reinvented in combat, which aligns with the purpose of the ruined machines as tools of war. Should it be Rhindaughter, we could associate human knowledge with alchemy and the artificial creation of life, which could offer us a sort of possibility that could link this to the forbidden methods of creation that Koitar taught the Voyager. Should it be Hraptatir, we could then establish a strong link between him and Dottore by shared commonalities of academic rigor, or a tangential comparison of knowledge between the Universitas Magistrorum and the Sumeru Academia in terms of the types of pursuit that it allows and forbids. Should it be the Voyager, then it would make sense for some speculations that they eventually became the founder of Khaenri'ah, establishing an idea that human knowledge as it was passed down was originally a form of wisdom that predated the arrival of the heavenly principles. Lastly, the supplementing of natural materials on individual human beings is what I believe another direction that Khaenri'ahs would have gone to if not for the Abyss. The five sinners were made possible due to the fact that the Abyss offers them the power to transcend their current limits and impose their wills on fate to pursue their own respective obsessions. In an alternate scenario, the people of Khaenri'ah could have pushed through with the research of the iridescent moon marrow and maybe even attempted to share amongst themselves the possible augmentation of Kuvaki. I do think that with Dottore extracting the moon fragments from Natlan, he is planning to achieve the exact same thing with Kuvaki. And so, considering his fields of research, Dottore might be a representation of human evolution and the bottomless obsession over their own goals and desires. This, I believe, is one side of the human power. That just like the Khaenri'ah civilization, they have the capacity to transcend natural limits by their own accord, using machines or deliberate experiments to test how they would hold energies like Archon residue and Kuvaki instead of dabbling with abyssal energy. If we have primordial energies and the potency of human evolution as two powers that could rival the gods, then what does Capitano, the first harbinger, represent? Throughout the Natlan Archon Quest, we were given light on Capitano's motives of expediting once again to Natlan to seize the Gnosis. During his fight with Mawika, the Archon noted that she felt as if she was fighting the pinnacle of human strength. Though inflicted with the curse of immortality due to his Khaenri'ah origins, this didn't deter him from expressing his strength and achieving his goals of leading his people back to the ley lines. His exact strength of will is what allowed the Lord of the Night to merge with him to reweave and strengthen Natlan's ley lines once again. Several of his fellow harbingers even remarked of his righteousness and personal responsibility as part of his power, but even if we take into account his life before as Thrain, who once served as commander under Khaenri'ah's Eclipse dynasty, he could only do much to salvage his people from the cataclysm, and had no other means of quelling it himself. I don't believe this to be a good basis to measure his power, however, and clearly I don't think his combat prowess even against the Abyss would be capable of encapsulating that. I think we should instead look at his individual capacity as a leader and his self-sufficient means in achieving whatever objective he sets regardless of the obstacle that stands against him. First, we have his negotiation with Renova, where he uses his Curse of Immortality to reason in favor of granting him repose. With it also came a favorable condition that frees Mawika from this exchange, offers a way for the Lord of the Night to prolong their existence, and a passageway for the dead to return to the ley lines in peace. On the surface, this might have looked like fate is smiling on them for such an ideal circumstance to happen, but this wouldn't really make any difference similar to the previous examples I mentioned in regards to fate. After all, Citlali already had foreseen this event, which caused her increasing concern for Mawika throughout the Archon Quest. In one way or another, this is just as similar as Vedrfolnir's prophecies on the Fontaine Crisis and Khaenri'ah's fall under the Vinster King. Supposedly, Mawika was to be sacrificed in exchange of drawing power from Renova. Speaking from the notion of fate, no one was supposed to stop it, yet Capitano managed to pull a Fossilor-level diversion for this fate to be expressed in another way. This was all made possible because Capitano raised the threat of a paradox that uses the same Curse of Immortality bestowed upon him to turn Renova's own authority against her. It's out of the possible risk that it will unravel the rules of the world, which is something the Heavenly Principles fundamentally want to avoid. The Heavenly Principles is just as subdued under fate that Renova would rather forsake her own rules to keep its rule over Tevat. And I think that this just presented another layer to the idea of human obsession, since, as opposed to Dottore and the Five Sinners, Capitano transmuted this idea into human perseverance and determination. His plan initially involved seizing the Gnosis not only because he needed to fulfill the Tsaritsa's request, but because he was already set on negotiating with the Heavenly Principles on his own accord. Just as Mawika had her own 500-year plan for Natlan, Capitano already came under drastic preparations by modifying his heart to host the many souls he's brought with him in order to be eventually released into the ley lines should his plan carry out. And although he lost his duel against Mawika, he never stopped pushing for his plan, reaching to the point of even discovering the dragon's secret source technology to access the Night Kingdom so that he could reweave the ley lines himself. When you have Khaenri'ahs like Lothar, who only despaired with the Curse of Immortality, Capitano saw benefit from it, which gave him leverage on his negotiation with Renova. This tells us that in the larger picture of Khaenri'ah's situation, Capitano would have been an example of what the humans of Khaenri'ah should have been if they held on to their human will. Possibly, what made Capitano reputedly powerful could be the same power from beyond that dainsleif alludes to their own humanity. And I think what makes Capitano stronger than a primordial goddess in an evolutionary power is that he embodied the other expression of the power of the human will. One that needed no augmentation nor invention, or a blessing of any primordial energy, yet capable of being in harmony and standing toe-to-toe with the already existing world-defying powers in Teyvat. Maybe this was the original intent for the Heavenly Principles' creation of humanity, to answer fate as convergent beings who can command world-defying powers instead of associating with them. Perhaps the hidden message of Khaenri'ah's fate under the Venster King was that the kingdom chose to defy the world by serving the Abyss, thus abandoning the power they once had. And now, we go back to the category of world-defying powers made up of descenders from beyond the stars, the original dragon inhabitants, the primordial guardians of the moons, and the calamity-wreaking Abyss. The very premise of Genshin Impact is that the traveler yearns to be reunited with their sibling, who as of now was made the heir to the abyssal throne. The traveler was revealed to be a descender, while the sibling wasn't, possibly connotating to the fact that they could have been another descender only if they were not imbibed by the abyss. Upon discovering the key to their hibernation chamber, more questions have perplexed the traveler as their sibling successfully used the Loom of Fate to revive Khaenri'ah with the Atlas of the New World. Wishing for them to return to what once was, the traveler will soon face their hardest ordeal. As the traveler ventures into the different nations of the Seven, they earn insights and more understanding on the workings of humanity, and soon they shall be the node that attaches to humanity in representation of their fate. And in the end, they must face their sibling, who seek to reunite with the traveler to speak in equal levels with the heavenly principles. Should the traveler participate in their sibling's plan, they would risk giving up their power as a descender and fail humanity once again as the Abyss takes over as Teyvat's new ruler. Should they remain steadfast in the meaning of their journey, they would need to accept that their sibling is long gone, and they must vanquish the last traces of the Abyss by drenching their sword in the blood of who was once their kin. Just as the abyssal energies and Kuvaki could only overcome each other and have one forced to come out on top, this final meeting would emerge similarly, offering no negotiations. Dainsleif might have had a way to rescue the sibling, using the same power of humanity that Capitano proved to be reachable, but this likely won't be the ideal outcome that the traveler wished for themselves. And no matter what happens among the world-defying factions, Teyvat always remain tethered in the power games of fate. After all, that is indeed the cruel truth of fate. It will never negotiate and will remain unmoved by anyone's sacrifices. Thank you, Denalists, and I appreciate your time watching this video. If you want more of these thought-provoking, logic-pondering, lore-adjacent deep dives, consider liking this video and subscribe to stay tuned in more of my explorative videos. And with that, I'll be seeing you in the next video. I'm Mercanique, and this is Lore and Explore. I wish you all amazing days ahead.